It's been a great September as we start our new program year, and I'm very excited. We have steadfast and true elected leaders. Your wardens, Cliff Allen and Miguel Gomez-Ibanez, were read for you today, and they have been with us throughout the summer and throughout the years, giving us wisdom and courage. You have a strong and seasoned staff. It's great that no one's new this year. I'm delighted. Our tremendous choir has returned, and our church school started today at 10. And this past summer, many loyal members allowed our church worship to run smoothly, standing in as vergers to set up our worship space, ushers to greet us, hosts to feed us, and as preachers, reading past historic sermons. Vestry member Patricia Bass, whose ancestors were slaves in Mississippi, preached the sermon offered after the death of Boston's famed anti-slavery crusader, Charles Sumner. Her voice rang out to honor that abolitionist. We also know that life is challenging, and we all have feet of clay, even at church. For while our history contains that stirring paean to Charles Sumner at the time of his death, during his life, Sumner didn't choose to worship here, although he had been raised here as a child. Was it because King's Chapel never took a stand on the Civil War or on slavery? Did our minister appropriately refrain from articulating a position on a partisan battle as our annals, our history records? Or was it that too many of our members profited from slavery? The cheap Southern cotton shipped to our northern textile mills, predicated on unpaid slave labor. These kinds of questions are ever with us. Just this past week, I've been grappling with social justice issues too. And I'm intensely aware that I have an empty space within me that craves affirmation, really wants to get along with everyone. Does that hunger prevent me from taking stands that justice requires? Blessedly, this church is congregational in structure, which means each of us get a vote, and decisions aren't mine alone to make. And so together, we discern how to build here at King's Chapel a thriving church, a community where we do more than gather and care about one another, though that is central. We also gather in service to humankind, and we gather to be challenged to change into the people we want to be, are intended to be, but aren't quite yet. And that really excites me, though it scares me too. How about you? Today's two parables are about this. Initially, we get to delight that the two stories Jesus told are about banquets and feasts, where everyone is invited. How perfect is that for today? A feast where everyone gets in, no RSVPs required. Even Jesus said so. Can't get more on message than that. But as with so many of Jesus's parables, that good lesson about welcome, the lesson we most readily see, isn't the full meaning. In the first parable Jesus tells, the setting is a wedding banquet, apparently before little tinted cards were made to mark everyone's exact seat. Nevertheless, the ritual that we all know took place. The bride and the groom, or perhaps really their parents, had spent hours debating who gets the seats of honor. You know the drill. There might be a family feud going on, and you have to declare which side you're on. Does Uncle Hal or Aunt Lou get the seat nearer to the mother of the bride? And the town official who is attending, well, you might want to give him easy access to that open bar, since our request for a permit for the new carpentry shop is still pending. So at this wedding banquet, Jesus explains, you might be asked to vacate the seat you've selected if you chose a seat of honor. Very awkward, terribly embarrassing. Jesus advises that we just take the seat by the kitchen door, or maybe with the people who are sitting alone. Now, it could be that Jesus is being shrewd, like the hosts, and is aware of how the scene will look. He's offering hints on winning those modesty points, or at least a strategy to avoid humiliation. We New Englanders understand this. We value humility too. Children of Puritans Modesty is a known virtue. Yankees are not showy, won't flaunt their wealth, and to grab a seat of honor is in poor taste. Humility proves you're well bred. And like the lesson of welcome, that's not a bad takeaway from this story. It is generally a plus to be humble. Writer Frederick Buechner, however, thinks the parable goes further. Beyond welcome and humility, it actually offers a whole other way of living, changing our hearts within so that we welcome or are humble not just to follow the rules, but because of the joy it brings. Buechner skewered me with his Vermont wit with these terse words about humility. Humility is often confused with the gentlemanly self-deprecation of saying you're not much of a bridge player when you know perfectly well you are. Conscious or not, this kind of humility is a form of gamesmanship. If you really aren't much of a bridge player, you're apt to be rather proud of yourself for admitting it so humbly. This kind of humility is a form of low comedy. True humility, he says, doesn't consist of thinking ill of yourself or of not thinking of yourself, true humility doesn't consist of thinking ill of yourself, but of not thinking of yourself much differently from the way you'd be apt to think of anyone else. It's the capacity for being no more and no less pleased when you play your own hand well than when your opponents do. Rats. It means that I cannot humbly take a seat in the nosebleed section of the stands and spend the whole game secretly hoping I'd be summoned up to a skybox, preferably with my ascension displayed on the Jumbotron. That would be the kind of daydream I'd have, those of you who know me. But it seems that Jesus is offering more than a strategy of starting low so you can rise high. Remember the second parable Jesus tells, where we are the host and not the guest. Jesus says, don't invite only those who will invite us back next time, who might just connect us with their network. Instead, invite people who won't ever be able to repay you. Life is not just about me and what I gain in the exchange, how I'm viewed. We're not urged to be modest or humble so that we'll earn reputation points and prove we're well-bred. Rather, Jesus is describing a way of living where we're genuinely as happy if we sit near the kitchen or at the head table, where we rejoice that another person got the seat of honor just as much as if we were ushered up to the dais ourselves. Sounds like a freedom and a joy that flows from when we finally understand that just being at the banquet is enough. It's a gift that we really want, and we already have it. The seating's immaterial. You've been given the gift of life, and life is the gift of time enough to love. That realization that you're already a guest at the banquet gives you an ego healthy enough that you genuinely don't care where you're seated, whether you benefit or not. And I'll tell you, I'm not there. Now, according to many Christian traditions, as many people have experienced it, if you, with me, ever care about your image or ever devise strategies for advancing, then this is the moment when you should start feeling guilty. And if your own feelings of guilt and self-derision aren't sufficiently strong to make you change your ways, well, then religion, the church, will inform you that God himself is disappointed in you and in me, that soon he'll be the one tapping you on the shoulder while we're still sitting in that place of honor that we've craved and judging you and me inadequate for that honor, and we'll point to the seat down there below, the only one for which we're fit, and humiliated. We descend to our seat by the kitchen door as people whisper behind their napkins about our demotion. And then, if we're too ashamed or too angry, we'll keep walking through the kitchen door and away. The party is over for us. This is how church loses people. If crushed by their apparent sinfulness, They limp away and at their deathbed still worry to their minister that God is deeply disappointed in them. But if they're angry or resilient, they either rail against a cruel church bent on protecting others from that painful experience, or they learn to rail against other perceived sinners, having learned from their church that we change only if we're mocked. Is that really what Jesus intended? Did he want this parable to teach us that the institutional church acts like a wedding host in the first parable, the one who out of his own self-interest established a hierarchy of honor among his guests? Didn't you actually think that that first host was cruel to oust a guest from his seat? Couldn't it be that that first parable was actually intended by Jesus to subvert the notion of any host who would be so conscious of what others thought of him, so absorbed in his own self-interest that he'd demean one of the people he'd invited for his own advantage? I think the point of the first parable is to show us that God is not a host like that. Instead, he's like the host in the second parable, who understands we can't reciprocate and still invites us anyway. The host who so wants us at his party that the doors are flung open, whose worst fear is that we'll stay away, having gone through the kitchen, never coming back. And so the poor and the maimed and the lame and the blind all get embossed invitations in the mail and can hardly believe it. We who are poor in our self-image, dressed barely in rags sometimes, we who are maimed by some past shaming as damaging as a physical caning, we who've made so many lame excuses before, but really, really, really hope that we can change this time. We who are so blind to our own failings that sometimes we're a bit obnoxious as a result. All of us invited to the banquet. This week, I read a collection of poetry that has half Western Christian saints and the other half Eastern mystics from other faiths, Buddhism and Islam. It's called Love Poems from God. And here's one I found by Muslim Sufi master Hafiz, who wrote a poem in the 1300s. It's entitled, If God Invited You to a Party. If God invited you to a party and said, everyone in the ballroom tonight will be my special guest, how would you then treat them when you arrived? Indeed, indeed. And Hafiz knows that there is no one in the world who is not standing upon God's jeweled dance floor. If God invited you to a party and said, everyone in the ballroom tonight will be my special guest, how would you treat them when you arrived? I tried to think about Abraham Lincoln or Desmond Tutu inviting us to a banquet, saying that all 100 of us there were his special guests, and we arrive and, well, there's Mother Teresa, but also a mass murderer, and many others we don't know. How would we look at all the guests, each God's special guest that night? Or maybe Tutus or Lincolns. Might you think a little better of yourself when alongside Mother Teresa, both of you special guests? Would you tend to hold in abeyance your condemnation of the murderer, also a special guest? What does God know that you don't? And for all the others, how would you lean, knowing that Lincoln and Tutu and God made them their special guests? And then maybe you'd glance down at the floor and notice that everyone was standing on God's jeweled dance floor. Oh, it's so good to have been invited. The two parables give us two choices, you see, about how to understand life on earth. In one version, we fight for our position, that of our family and our country. Wise people engage in a calculus. Every time we see somebody else, we constantly assess them, compare ourselves to them, differentiate ourselves. Who'd be more likely to get the place of honor? We have a constant unspoken need, says Richard Rohr, to dominate and to win. We don't really get joy from win-win situations. Win-lose is our frank preference, and we're going to vie to win. In this view, reality is just what we see all around us about producing and consuming. And in that reality, it's hard for love to grow beyond our immediate friends and family. But the second vision of life is that Heifetz gave us, and the second parable where God actually loves and adores people. Every person is equally loved and adored despite their limping and their stuttering ways. There's no hierarchy of earth. And once we grasp that, we treat all the other guests as God's special guests and honor them. We're thrilled to be on the jeweled dance floor. I don't know which is harder for you. We're all different. Is it harder to believe that yourself is loved and adored? Believe that others might equally be? Or acting on these beliefs as joyful as when another wins as when you do? Might depend on how often you've tried treating another person as special and they treated you like something rotten. Whether someone you admired taught you that competition makes the economy tick and makes you stronger, and frankly, it's worked for you. If you found solace in comparisons, reassured of your value by your better grades and appearance and salary or family tree, so your addiction to comparisons is pretty tenacious. And it may depend on how great a struggle life has been for you, the dance floor forever falling out from under you, or feeling more like shards of glass than bejeweled. Our path is not easy, but it's also not solitary. It doesn't need to be. Because have you glimpsed the joy of which Heifetz speaks, the truest reality, which a storyteller named Jesus yearned for us to see in his second dinner party parable, the kind known among dear friends, a time when you were invited over to a party and when you were genuinely not expected to bring anything or to later return the favor. They really wanted to see you and to be with you, and were so delighted when you arrived. May we find that here. May we be that to one another, providing a glimpse of life as it's meant to be, starting now at the Parish House Banquet. As we gather at that table, as we listen to God's word, help us know, oh God, your presence. Let our hearts and minds be stirred. Nourish us with sacred story till we claim it as our own. Teach us through your holy banquet how to make love's victory known. Amen.